In the night between the 16th and the 17th of July 1918, the 304-year-old history of the Romanov family was interrupted through an act of violence and brutality. This is a story that begins in 1894 and that will end only in 2007. This is the story of the last Tsars, the Romanovs. The story of the Romanov family ruling over Russia begins all the way back in 1613, when Mikhail Romanov, the son of at the time the spiritual leader of Russia, was chosen as a heir to the throne. This was the end chapter of a 15-year-old period of political confusion and instability. The Romanov line continued almost completely smoothly, until when in 1894, Nikolai Romanov became Tsar Nicholas II. Despite having studied law at St. Petersburg University, Nicholas had no clue on how to actually run a country, and was often described as weak, submissive, and insecure. In addition to all of this, he always and only hired people who wouldn't be a threat to his very conservative ideal and belief in divine right. Of course, this led to some terrible decisions, which had equally as many terrible consequences. Just to list a few, some of these extremely poor decisions were the fact that a war was carried out between Japan and Russia in 1904, which was a complete and utter failure, but also the decision of making soldiers and the armed forces shoot on the mobs that had created in 1905 to protest against terrible working conditions. Now, some of the consequences of these terrible decisions were the angering of the Russian people. In fact, as a consequence of shooting on the mobs in 1905, there was a first attempt of revolution coming from the people of Russia. This attempt was failed because the Russian army, the Russian Imperial Army, responded with violence and force, with weapons, shooting at the crowds and killing hundreds. Just like her husband, Tsarina Alexandra liked to have around her people who wouldn't get in the way. Grigory Rasputin was one of these people. He was a priest, and he had come all the way from Siberia to St. Petersburg, and he claimed he could allegedly cure illnesses with its mystic powers. You must know, though, that Tsarevich Alexei, the son of the royal couple, had been diagnosed with an illness called hemophilia. He had inherited this illness from his mother, and the symptoms of hemophilia were so dangerous at the time that even the smallest injury could mean death, thus putting the succession of the Russian throne, in danger. So, Tsarina Alexandra had to resort to Rasputin. Rasputin, though, apparently made a good job at alleviating the symptoms of the illness, and Alexei started feeling better. And he stuck around for quite a bit, actually. But in the meantime, the First World War had started. Once the war had started in 1914, Tsar Nicholas decided to make himself head of the Russian army, and therefore had to go to the front to coordinate the military operations. In the meantime, in Russia, his wife had all the powers, and had the power to rule over the whole of the Russian territory. However, she had no political experience, and bear in mind, she was German by birth, and her cousin was Kaiser Wilhelm II, Russia's greatest enemy at the time. So this for sure didn't help with her public image. But to make matters even worse, as Rasputin was so close to her, she decided to give him a formal role in the government of Russia, thus giving him power to hire and fire all the people he wanted, according to his personal will. So this, of course, angered substantially the Russian nobility, and the situation started escalating. In the meantime, on the front line, the Russian army was suffering defeat after defeat, and heavy casualties had scarred the Russian army. This is when the Russians had had enough. So the situation for the Romanovs became bad day by day, and it peaked when, in December 1916, Rasputin was killed by a group of angry noblemen. In addition, in March 1917, precisely the 8th of March 1917, more than 100,000 women gathered in St. Petersburg on International Women's Day to protest against the government. And of course, the Tsars, and at the time Tsarina Alexandra, who had been in charge for the country while her husband had been at war, didn't know how to act and didn't know what to do in a country where food was lacking and unaffordable, and jobs were difficult to find, and people were exploited in order to support the war effort. By the 10th of March, 2 days later, the protests had continued, and more than 250,000 people had gathered. So, the city of St. Petersburg was completely blocked. At this point, Tsar Nicholas had to intervene because his wife couldn't cope with this, and he told his generals to shoot on the mobs. But as soon as the Russian soldiers heard the orders, they took their guns and pointed them at the officers. The riots and protests became so violent and intense that by March the 15th, Tsar Nicholas had to abdicate and the royal palace was seized. Initially, they were put on house arrest, but the new provisional government wanted to exile them, wanted them out of the country. So, Tsar Nicholas asked his cousin, George V of Great Britain, if he could keep them in. And initially he accepted, but then had to refuse, after he realized what a terrible reputation the Romanovs had made for themselves in Great Britain. So, they were taken to Tobolsk. However, unluckily, the story does not end here. In fact, after the 8th of November 1917, when Vladimir Lenin seized the government, a more violent approach was taken. To start with, the Bolsheviks expelled many of the royal family's relatives and restricted the Romanovs' diet only to army rations. The Romanovs were then moved to Ekaterinburg and were lodged in a house called the House of Special Purpose. This was the start of the end of their days. Shortly after midnight on July 17th, 1918, the Russian royal family was told to go in the basement for their own personal safety. And once they reached the room they were told to go into, a group of armed men told them they were going to be executed. The family, including the children, were all brutally shot. And some of the people, especially the 5 children, the 4 girls and the only boy, survived the first round of bullets because of the jewels on their clothing that had acted as a shield. So the soldiers then walked towards them and shot them in the head and poked bayonets in their bodies to assure they were dead. Their bodies were buried in 2 unmarked locations next to a local road. One of the 2 burial sites was recovered and found in 1979, and the other one in 2007. The bodies found in 79, though, couldn't be analyzed until 1991, after the Soviet Union had finally collapsed. And they could be buried only in 1998. This is the tragic story of a family whose fate was doomed since the beginning. The story of the end of a dynasty, the story of the end of an era, and the beginning of a new one.